Vindicate me, O Yahweh, for I have integrity, and I trust in Yahweh without wavering. Examine me, O Yahweh, and test me. Evaluate my inner thoughts and motives, for I am ever aware of your faithfulness, and your loyalty continually motivates me. I do not associate with deceitful men or consort with those who are dishonest. I hate the mob of evil men and do not associate with the wicked. I maintain a pure lifestyle so I can appear before your altar, O Yahweh, to give you thanks and to tell about your amazing deeds. O Yahweh, I love the temple where you live, the place where your splendor is revealed. I do not sweep me away with sinners, or execute me along with violent people, who are always ready to do wrong, or offer a bribe. But I have integrity. Rescue me and have mercy on me. I am safe, and among the worshippers I will praise Yahweh. Good morning, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. We are going to do part 2 of our presentation about whether the hadith support the idea of a perfect Quran. So peace be with you, Captain. Peace be with you, Gypsy. I hope you're both well. Peace be with you, Bruheim, and peace be with you, Hawaiian. When I start the presentation, I'm going to be reading my notes, so I won't be able to see the screen and I won't be able to see the chat. So if you're throwing questions at me whilst I'm reading from my notes, I'm just going to miss them. I apologize. So perhaps hold back on your questions until such a time as I invite them. So without further ado, let's pick up exactly where we left off. So we're going to start with the narration by Anas. Uthman called Zayd bin Thabit, Abdullah bin Az-Zubair, Sayyid bin al-As, and Abdur Rahman bin al-Harith bin Hisham, and when they wrote the manuscripts of the Quran, Uthman said to the 3 Qurayshi persons, if you differ with Zayd bin Thabit on any point of the Quran, then write it in the language of the Quraysh. Now really, we've got to ask a question here. Just stop and think what you've heard. How can you write a dialect of the Quraysh without the dots and the dashes that vocalize and capture the dialectical structure above and below the consonantal structure, which is known as the rasim? The sort of basic script is written without these sort of vocalizations, these vowelizations, these other marks that would allow a dialect to be described in a written codification. It almost seems a bit post hoc, it's kind of like retrospectively projecting backwards some later development in the language that all the evidence suggests probably wasn't there at the time. Now, it seems to me that people are, that this cries really that Muslims were reciting their Qurans differently, and as it is a standardizing dialectical differences, dialects will use different words to mean the same thing, or even the same word to refer to different things. So in terms of a dialect is a uncodified language. That is what a dialect is. We've got dialects in the UK, Cockney, London speak, or I'm trying to think of another one, Liverpudlian, or Yorkshire. These are all dialects of the English language, but they're not codified. The reason why the English language is codified is because it was standardized through the King James Bible, and it was standardized through the Book of Common Prayer. Now, it's undeniable that the Quran played a massive import and impact in standardizing the norms of the Arabic language. But that obviously means that before this standardization, before this Quranic effect on the Arabic language, that there were no rules per se for the written text to be codified by. And this is standardizing, therefore, a particular dialect, the dialect of the Quraysh, which means that there must have been different dialects. And if there are different dialects, then that means there would have been different words. And if there were different words, whether they were referring to the same thing or even using the same word to refer to different things, that means you have differences in both recitation and text. So clearly by this point, at least the hadith was written, different Qurans must have been in existence. As the Quran was revealed, and the hadith goes on, as the Quran was revealed in their language, so they acted accordingly. Now just stop, think again what you've heard. This seems to be justifying one text of the Quran. However, the obvious question therefore arises, why was this necessary if the hadiths about Abu Bakr that we'd read in part 1 of this presentation are valid? Had this work not already been done once already? Why does it need to be done again? And furthermore, if we are saying that we're justifying one text of the Quran at the time of Uthman, that implies again that there must have therefore been other text. And that's Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 4, 510 and 507, found on page 466 of the work that we had quoted in part 1. Another hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, 510, page 479. Zayd bin Thabit added a verse from Surat Azab was missed by me. That's the words in the hadith. Just think what you've just heard. The editor-in-chief of the editing process of the text of the Quran is acknowledging that he made mistakes, that he himself had missed verses. Others are said to have missed verses, and we've noted that in an earlier hadith in part 1, and verses are only found with one person, again in reference to another hadith that we'd referenced in part 1. I think if this evidence therefore is valid, we have sufficient grounds to doubt whether the Quran has been captured completely at its inception, because Zayd bin Thabit is saying that I forgot verses, other people forgot verses, and we found singular verses existing just with one person. Now, given the fact that all of this demonstrates a sort of ship with leaks, how can we have any certainty that the whole of the Quran has been successfully compiled? The hadith continues. When we copied the Quran. So we copied the Quran after editing it. So this would suggest that the Thabit Mushaf had been compiled. And the hadith goes on. And I used to hear Allah's apostle reciting it, so we searched for it and found it with Khuzaimah bin Thabit al-Ansari. It does not say in what form, whether they found this particular verse in a verbal form or in a written form with this gentleman Ansari, just that they found it with him, but we're uncertain as to how and in what form. That verse was, among the believers are men who have been true to their covenants with Allah, which you can find in today's Quran in Surah 33, Ayah 23. Now, clearly, what we see here is that after the initial impetus was done to compile the Quran, it was then revised due to errors made the first time around. Thus, at that exact moment in time, there were variant Qurans in existence. The one before revision and the one after revision. Now, if multiple Qurans could exist then why not at any other time in history? Because the fact of the matter is, if you've got a text and people were using that text and then that text is revised, then you have two texts. Or at least you had one text that was deficient at one point in time. This is all fairly logical stuff. Now, it makes me think that could hadiths like this be trying to account for variant Qurans which had missing verses at the time that these hadiths were being created, explaining why some had certain verses and others did not? That's obviously a purely speculative question from me, but it's obvious that hadiths were being made to account for the problems of their time, and we see that in lots of other areas in the hadith literature. Why would that maxim not also be true for the hadiths dealing with this kind of topic? Moving on to As-Sayuti al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, page 138. It says, Zayed said, I missed a verse from Al-Azab, Surah 33, when we transcribed the Mus'haf, the written text of the Quran under Uthman's supervision. Just think what you've just heard. This would seem to suggest that in the lifetime of Zayed bin Thabit, who was the one who oversaw the creation of at least 3 Mus'hafs to my reckoning, the one for Abu Bakr, the one for Uthman, and then the revision to Uthman's version, the first one. Thus, if there were erroneous Qurans produced at the time of Thabit, why not after? And how would these have been spotted over such a vast empire? Or how would they have been affected by the recitation? I want to stress here, I do not believe that the Quran is lost to us. I'm not making that argument. I believe that the Quran actually is a very well-preserved text. However, very well preserved is a vast ocean away from perfectly preserved, and that is precisely the problem. I used to hear the hadith, this source continues, I used to hear the Messenger of Allah reciting it. We searched for it and found it with Khuzamai ibn Thabit al-Ansari. From among the believers are men who are faithful to their covenants with Allah, 33:23. So why was this passage not found with any one of the many thousands who are meant to have memorized the Quran? I mean, aren't we supposed to believe that the thing that guarantees the integrity of the Quran's existence today is the fact that lots of people have memorized it? If it turns out that at the very beginning certain verses were only being found with one person and not with anyone else, doesn't that therefore mean that we have good reason, a solid reason, reasonable reasons to believe that other verses may have been lost? The source continues. So we inserted it in the relevant surah in the text. In Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, 510, page 479 of the work quoted in part 1 of this presentation, we read, Hudhaifa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq. Now, differences in the recitation. Hold on one second. I think I've just made a boo-boo with my notes, so I just need to check something. It's all right. I've highlighted something as a note when actually it's part of the text that I should be quoting. So if you just bear with me, please. Just correct it, and then I'll carry on. Right. So the text goes on. Hudhaifa was afraid of their, and by this it means the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. Now, think about this for a second. Why fear? If the Quran was preserved, what was there to be afraid of? He states clearly it is differences in recitation, and thus a crisis has been reached because of the differences in recitation that leads to an action in response. But what does the people at the time do? What does the hadith say that they do in reaction to this crisis? What is their response? Is it, for instance, the gathering of reciters to simply jot down what they recite? This is what the text says. So he said to Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book, which is the Quran, as the Jews and the Christians did before. Now stop. The crisis is seen as such that the Ummah is at risk of falling into disagreements like the Jews and the Christians did before. So how did the Jews and the Christians, what happened to them according to the Islamic narrative? Their text was corrupted. So Hudhaifa is seeing the threat that the text of the Quran could be corrupted because of differences in the recitations. Think about that for a moment. This is obviously not a small crisis. These are not matters merely of pronunciation that could create this kind of sense of danger, but clearly differences in words, possibly sentences, differences that would require what to resolve them. The text goes on. So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa saying, send us the manuscripts of the Quran. Now, does this therefore not refer to a separate mushaf, or rather the disparate materials upon which the Quran was said to have been written, the bones and the leaves and the stone slates that were said to be used at the time of Muhammad? Notice he didn't just go, well, let's just get a couple of the people who've recited the Quran together and we'll just write it down and we'll sort out all the problem. I mean, if the apologist story is true, wouldn't that have been the normal thing to do? Unless, of course, that was not a resource that was available to them, or possibly because that was the very cause of the problem in the first place. The text goes on. So that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you. Why would you need to create perfect copies of the material if perfect copies already existed? Furthermore, why not just turn to the reciters amongst them? Oh wait, they couldn't agree. And that's why you needed to go to what? The text. So you get the text to solve the differences in recitation, which means that these are differences connected to the Rasim, connected to the basic Kufic script, because we know from archaeology how Arabic was written at this time. It was written in the Rasim, it was written in basic Kufic, thus showing that when push comes to shove, when two reciters cannot agree on how they remember a book, they refer to the book to solve the differences. Thus, this discounts the idea that the Quran is preserved as some pure tradition of recitation, disconnected and not in symbiosis with an actual textual tradition. Clearly, we have recitation variances and variations being evidenced here, and textual variations being evidenced elsewhere, and thus it is by faith alone that Muslims can say that the Quran is preserved and not based upon actual evidence. The text goes on. Hafsa sent it to Uthman. Uthman then ordered Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah bin Az-Zubair, and Sayyid bin al-As, and Abdur Rahman bin Harith bin Hashim to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. Now, what does this evidence? It evidences that perfect copies of the Quran are now produced from these manuscripts. Why then did he need to search for them? There are inconsistencies to the story of how the Quran is put together. If Hafsfa sent the manuscripts to him to make perfect copies of, why do other hadiths have him searching for missing verses? Weren't they all there in the original material? Weren't they there in all the mushafs that were being perfectly preserved? The text goes on. Uthman said to the three Qurayshi men, in case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of the Quraysh, as the Quran was revealed in their tongue. How can this be done when diacritical marks? That's what tells you the sort of dialectical differences. This line suggests to me that this is a later creation trying to explain away differences found at the time that this hadith was invented, which itself would still suggest a non-preserved Quran in perfection, but it would just point the problem actually further ahead into the future, given the perspective of the hadith. Further, the defense of the Dawah team defends variant Qurans with the argument that they are simply dialectical differences. Well, if the Quran is written in one dialect, as this text suggests that it is, where did these other dialectical differences emerge from? And at what point in time? Aren't we just now having dialectical differences emerge upon dialectical differences? Clearly, what we are speaking of when speaking of Hafs and Warsh are versions of the Quran. The problem is there is no hint of these versions in the Hadith history. No mention of the text being written in 7, as some Muslims argue, or 10 versions, as other Muslims argue. Which raises another point. The Dawah team like to boast that Muslims do not argue about how many verses or chapters there are in the Quran, unlike Christians, who do not agree with their canon or in their canon. And I agree, they do much worse. We Christians have canon issues that we have to wrestle with in comparison to the kind of arguments that Muslims have. But Muslims are arguing about how many versions of the Quran are. And I would like an answer. Are there 7 versions? Or are there 10 versions? Who is right? And that was from Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, 510, page 479. In Muwatta Imam Malik, page 64, we read, Abu Yunus, freedman of Aisha, mother of the believers, reported, Aisha ordered me to transcribe the Holy Quran. So here we see evidence of unofficial copying of the Quran going on as a private enterprise beyond the control of government. And if Aisha was doing it, we can pretty much guarantee that other people will be doing it as well in a non-controlled fashion. And obviously not all of those people are going to be trained, not all of those people are going to be competent. And the text goes on, and asked me to let her know when I should arrive at the verse, and I'm going to slaughter the Arabic, but I'm going to try it anyway. Hafduhu Allah salati wa salatil usta wa kurumu lilhalhi Nitin. That's probably terrible. To be found in Surah 2, Ayah 238. Now, this indicates that the revision about to be made was not in the Quran being used to transcribe the Quran and is therefore evidence of variant texts. So the Quran being used by Abu Yunus is different from the one he's about to make. the text goes on. When I arrived at the verse, I informed her, and she ordered, write it in this way. I'm going to slow to the Arabic again, but I'm going to do it just to show you that I'm reading from Muwatta ibn Malik, page 64. حفظه على صلاة وصلاة الوسطى وصلاة العصر وكرم لحاء قواتين. I apologize to anyone who's Arabic listening to this. I'm sure it's torture. I apologize. Now, think about this for a second. Here, we've just witnessed that words are being added. And if this story is true, then that means at this exact moment in time of this story, there are now two variant versions of the Quran sitting on the desk of Aisha, one with and one without the extra words. And this is done on her authority, not on the authority of the official scribes employed by the state. It's an editorial team of one, and she's quite certain about it. She added that she had heard it from the Apostle of Allah. Now, perhaps she did. I'm not saying she didn't. But why was the Quran she was using therefore deficient and missing these words that she knew needed to be added? And thus its recitation therefore is deficient. So any recitation based upon this deficient version with the words missing, assuming that she was correct, means that those recitations were all different. And if anyone learnt to recite the Quran using this deficient text, their memorization and recitation would also be deficient. But if she was wrong, then that means that she's added words, in which means her new version is deficient. And what happens if she remembers that some words were missing, but she hasn't remembered which words needed to be added? Do you see the problem? I'm sure you do. Reading from Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, 510, page 479, we read, Hudhaifa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, O chief of the believers, save the nation before they differ about the book, the Quran, as the Jews and the Christians did before. So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa, saying, send us the manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you. Hafsa sent it to Uthman. Uthman then ordered Zayd bin Thabit, Abdullah bin Az-Zubair, and Sayyid bin al-As, and Abdurrahman bin Harith bin Qashim to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. Uthman said to the three Qurayshi men, in case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of the Quraysh. As the Quran was revealed in their tongue, they did so. And when they had written many copies, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hafsa. Where did those materials go? Why don't we have them today? The text continues. Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what had been copied, and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Now think about this. Why order the destruction of things that are perfectly preserved? Why destroy things that match? This makes no sense to anyone who's a rational thinker. Clearly what is occurring is an attempt at the time of Uthman, not Muhammad, at the time of Uthman, to standardize the text which were understood at that time to be in variance with one another. Furthermore, this shows no Muslim should become angry at someone who burns the Quran. The Sahaba themselves ordered all variant copies of the Quran to be burned. However, note, this hadith acknowledges the existence of other whole and fragmentary copies of the Quran. Why would you destroy a whole Quran if you're simply replacing it with another whole Quran and both of these texts are perfectly preserved? Unless you are replacing one version with another due to the differences between them. This incidentally explains why there is a dearth of manuscript evidence from the 7th century. By contrast, just to give you an understanding of what I'm talking about, we have upwards of 66 whole copies and fragmentary forms of the New Testament from the 7th century, and 81 fragments, large and small, of the New Testament by the 3rd century. So where are all the Qurans from the 7th century? Where are all the fragments from the 7th century? Where are the complete copies from the 7th century? We just don't have them. At-Tabari, this is reading At-Tabari 162952. At-Tabari records that the people said to Uthman, the Quran was in many books, and you have now discredited them all but one. Now, I find this particular witness to be interesting because this would seem to correspond to something that John of Damascus said. Because in his writing, he refers to the Quran as being in books, not in a book. And at first I used to just dismiss that as him using Christian language to describe the Quran, because we speak of the book of Romans and the book of Galatians and the book of Deuteronomy. And I thought, maybe he's just being lazy in his language and he's using it to describe the Quran in a Christian way, but sloppily, because he'd be writing to a Christian audience, obviously. But then I read this, and I think to myself, does this correspond actually, that actually at the time of John of Damascus, maybe at the time that this hadith was written, maybe at the time that Uthman was alive, that the Quran wasn't understood to be a singular book, but existed in books? Which, because John of Damascus speaks of them as existing separately, could this be a projection backwards of developments occurring in Islam at the time of John of Damascus? I don't know. I'm just noting the correlation between the two ways that are being quite independently and for quite different reasons speaking about the same thing. In Ibn Abi Dawud, Kitab al-Masahif, page 83, we read, many of the companions of the Prophet of Allah had their own reading of the Quran, but they died and their readings disappeared soon afterwards. Now, clearly what seems to be the picture is that there were multiple versions of the Quran, close enough in kind to be seen as the same, but different enough as to be described as such, as to prompt the authorities to try to avert the disaster of that continuing, thus standardizing the text. However, this happened very early within Islamic history, so much so it's now wrapped up in myths and legends. In Ibn Abi Dawud, Kitab al-Masahif, page 22, we read the following. I hope you guys are finding this useful and enjoyable. By Allah, he did not act or do anything in respect of the manuscripts, the Masahif, except in full consultation with us. For he said, what is your opinion on this matter of qira'at, or readings? It has been reported to me that some are saying, my reading is superior to your reading. That is a perversion of the truth. We asked him, what is your view on this? He answered, My view is that we should unite the people on a single text. Now, please note, this is an admission that the people were not already united upon a single text. The Mus'haf, the source goes on, Mus'haf Wahid. Then there will be no further divisions or disagreements. Now, stop for a minute. This admits that the divisions and disagreements were connected to variable texts and recitations. The source goes on. We replied, what a wonderful idea. Now, stop for a minute. A wonderful idea? If it is so wonderful, why didn't Muhammad do it? How, if the Quran is true that upon this day I have perfected your religion and I have chosen for you the religion of Islam, if it was perfect at the time of Muhammad, how can you improve upon perfection? How can you make something better if it's already perfect? Logically, you can't. You can only make something better if it's deficient. And if it was deficient in some way, then it wasn't perfected. Therefore, the Quran would be wrong. Someone from the text, the source goes on, someone from the gathering there asked, whose is the purest Arabic among the people and whose reading is the best? They said the purest Arabic among the people was that of Sa'id ibn al-As, and the best reader among them was Zayd ibn Thabit. He, Uthman, said, let the one write and the other dictate. Therefore they performed their task, and he united the people on a single text. Now please note immediately the embarrassingly different narrative given here in this source that the earlier version just read and the other sources. Not also the process is now much reduced to just two people, one reciting and one scribing. Is this not what we said should have happened if all Muslims proclaimed that the Quran's preservation was true according to simple recitation tradition? This hadith corresponds much better to what Muslims claim to believe about their Quran. Though it's full of its own problems, in acknowledging both textual and recitation differences, prompting the unification upon a single text via one reciter and one transcriber. It smacks to me, at least, of a post hoc projection into the past of a view of how the Quran came to be, or answering the question how the Quran came to be and how can we be sure that it is what it is. It's also evidence of the idea of a recitation tradition, as in a belief in the preservation through recitation. Now, which of these variable accounts is the real history of the text of the Quran? I am confident that neither are, but the sources themselves conflict and the sources themselves are giving us different stories. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 5, page 96, and Volume 6, 521. Narrated Masruq Abdullah bin Masud was mentioned before Abdullah bin Abd. That is a man I still love. Had bin Jabal and Ubay bin Kab. Here the reciters of note are named such as Ibn Masud. If they had mushafs, why would they need to be destroyed when the Caliph commanded all variant Qurans whole and in part to be destroyed? Couldn't we trust a mushaf that came from Ibn Masud? or from Ubay Ka'b? Narrated Abdullah bin Masud, by Allah other than whom none has the right to be worshipped. There is no surah revealed in Allah's book, but I know at what place it was revealed. And there is no verse revealed in Allah's book, but I know about whom it was revealed. And if I know that there is somebody who knows Allah's book better than I, and he is at a place that camels can reach, I would go to him. This is found in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, 524, page 488. So, such is Masud's boast. However, true or not, I'm not saying it is true, I'm not saying it isn't true. It smacks of typical Arab overstatement and exaggeration, which is just a cultural trait. If we take it at face value, we should conclude any text connected to Ibn Masud or his recitation should be as good as any officially created. Sahih Muslim, volume 4, 6022, page 13 and 12. 12 and 13. I sat in the company of the companions of Muhammad, may peace be upon him, but I did not hear anyone having rejected that is his recitation or finding fault with it. Thus, the recitation of Masud is spoken of in the highest possible terms, leaving us with a perplexing problem. Why would his recitation and any text dependent upon him not exist alongside the official version, the one created by Uthman and Zayd bin Thabit? After all, wouldn't they have matched? In Ibn Abi Dawud Kitab al-Masahif, page 13, we read, Hudhaifa said, it is said by the people of Kufa, the reading of Abdullah ibn Masud, and it is said by the people of Basra, the reading of Abu Musa, by Allah, if I come to the commander of the faithful, I will demand that they be drowned. Abdullah said to him, do so, and by Allah you will also be drowned, but not in waters. Now, what appears to me to be happening is that sections of the people were supporting the tradition of Ibn Masud, and other sections were supporting other reciters, and thus any codexes attached to their recitation, or rather their recitation connected to a text. And yet it is said by Hudhaifa or Uthman, I'm not sure which, that this was enraging. Now, why was it enraging? After all, they're all meant to be the same. This points to the fact that a plan to standardize the text was being resisted by sections of the community. And why would you resist a standardization? Because it's taking away something that you have cultural pride in. People are naturally conservative to the things that they know and are naturally suspicious to new things, which means that the text that they were receiving officially was something that they understood to be new or different in some way from that which with they were familiar. Ibn Abi Dawud Kitab al-Masahif, page 14. Hudhaifa went on to say, O Abdullah ibn Qais, you were sent to the people of Basra as their governor and teacher, and they have submitted to your rules, your idioms, and your reading. He continued, O Abdullah ibn Masud, you were sent to the people of Kufa as their teacher, who have also submitted to your rules, idioms, and reading. Abdullah said to him, in that case, I have not led them astray. There is no verse in the Book of Allah that I do not know where it was revealed and why it was revealed, and if I knew anyone who learned in the Book of Allah and I could be conveyed there, I would set out to him. Ibn Masud here is confident of his recitation, and this shows multiple people were memorizing the Quran at the same time, but that their quality had degrees of perfection, that there were issues in quality. Ibn Masud is saying, if anyone could know better than me, I would go to him, implying that there were people that knew worse than him, less than him. Some being better than others in their ability to recite and to memorize the Quran implies variances in the oral transmission that are equivalent to the idea of textual variances. If people are reciting with different degrees of perfection, then you have recitation variants. Ibn Masud saw himself in the higher echelon of those that could memorize the Quran, meaning that there were people below him. And just as a textual variant is a variant of a word or a letter, any variant of memorization is also a variant in the recitation tradition. Ibn Abi Dawud, Kitab al-Masahif, page 14 is what I've just read. Moving in the same work to page 17, we read, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, I recited from the Messenger of Allah 70 surahs which I had perfected before Zayd bin Thabit had embraced Islam. Now, this saying seems to me at least an argument for the recitation of Ibn Masud over that of Zayd bin Thabit. One is being placed over the other, it would seem, in this line. Ibn Abi Dawud, Kitab al-Masahif, page 14. I acquired directly from the Messenger of Allah 70 surahs when Zayd was still a childish youth. Must I now forsake what I acquired directly from the Messenger of Allah? Ibn Masud is challenging the idea that he should give up what he had learned directly from the Prophet for the work of someone who was still a child when the Quran was being revealed and after he had already learned portions of the Quran. This shows that the Quran of Zayd bin Thabit was different to that of the one by Ibn Masud. These included 5 surahs: Surah 1, Surah 113, Surah 114, and then 2 surahs that I'm not sure we can find in the Quran today because I can only find their Arabic names. I can't find their numbers, but I am happy to be corrected because obviously I know the Quran by numbers, not by their Arabic names. And these are Al-Kal, which translates as the casting off, and Al-Haft, or the hastening. These apparently were rejected by the Uthmanic Codex, and in the Ibn Masud Codex, they could be found. Now, you may be wondering, what's my source for that claim? My source is Dr. Margin van Putten, showing indeed that contrary to the claims of the apologists, which might be true enough today, that in the past we can actually find Muslims disputing about how many surahs, how many chapters, how many verses should be in the Quran. Ibn Sa'id, Kitab al-Tabakat al-Kabir, Volume 2, page 414. The people have been guilty of deceit in the reading of the Quran. I like it better to read according to the recitation of him, the Prophet, whom I love more than that of Zayd ibn Thabit. By him besides whom there is no God, I learnt more than 70 surahs from the lips of the Apostle of Allah, May Allah bless him, while Zayd bin Thabit was a youth, having 2 locks and playing with the youth. I don't think that needs any further commentary or words additional to what I've already said. Reading from Ibn Sa'd, Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir, Volume 2, page 441. Affan ibn Muslim informed us, on the authority of Anas ibn Malik, he, on the authority of the Prophet, may Allah bless him, he said, the best reader of the Quran among my people is Ubay ibn Ka'b. All the same arguments about Ibn Mas'ud can now be applied to Ibn Ka'b. Therefore, why destroy works based upon these men? What would be the reason if they're all the same? The obvious answer is that they were not. Sahih Muslim, Volume 4, 6032, page. I'm thinking that must be a typo, because if it is, if that's the actual page number, that's a huge book. So the page number is 13,113, which makes me think that that's got to be a typo and that it's probably a different page. So I apologize about that if I'm wrong. It could be that big. Anas b. Malik reported that Allah's Messenger, may peace be upon him, said to Ubay ibn Ka'b, I have been commanded to recite to you the Surah Al-Bayyinah, which opens with these words, Lam yakunal lathina kafaru. Lie, he said. Has he mentioned me by name? He said, yes. Thereupon he shed tears of joy. Now, here, if this hadith is to be believed, Allah himself is said to have honored Ibn Ka'b, in such a way that Muhammad is commanded to recite the Quran to him in person. Could Zayd ibn Thabit say that he had received a similar honor? I don't think he could. And then the question goes that if your God has honored someone, why on earth are you going to someone else? Continuing. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, 527, page 489. Narrated Ibn Abbas, Umar said, Ubay was the best of us in recitation of the Quran, yet we leave some of what he recites. Ubay says, I have taken it from the mouth of Allah's apostle, and will not leave it for anything whatever. What Allah said, none of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, but we substitute something better or similar. Surah 2, Ayah 106. Even within the lifetime of the Prophet, we have proof of recitation differences at the very emergence of the community itself, even as the Quran is being revealed. To which Allah says he is cutting out some of what he had previously given as part of the Quran. This obviously begs the question, what was the point in giving it in the first place? If it was not good enough even to outlive the revelation of the Quran itself or the lifetime of the Prophet in its own usefulness and utility, was there any point in revealing it at all? Why do some verses still exist in the Quran that are considered to be abrogated, whilst others were caused to be forgotten? And finally, Ibn Abi Dawud, Kitab al-Masahif, page 117. Altogether, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf made 11 modifications in the reading of the Uthmanic text. In Al-Baqarah, Surah 259, it originally read Lam Yatasana Wandur, but it was altered to Lam Yatasana. In Al-Ma'idah, Surah 548, it read Shari'atan wa minhajan, but it was altered to Shari'atwa minhajan. So again, I apologize to anyone who's Arabic. It must sound awful. However, I'm just trying to show you that I'm reading from a text. I'm not making this stuff up because I wouldn't even know how to imitate Arabic. I'm sure it's given you all a good laugh. The point, therefore, we see in conclusion is that when you analyze the actual Islamic texts themselves, the actual books of Islam and Islamic history, we find evidence that the Quranic text was not perfectly preserved. It would appear to me, in my summary thoughts, that what was revealed as being the Quran at the time of Muhammad was much bigger than that which was found eventually into a text, and that when it was made into a text, it was made for them. There was a clear attempt to centralize that codification, but it wasn't universally controlled, and that other people were making manuscripts, and that these manuscripts were different, and that people were reciting different Qurans, forcing yet another attempt to try and centralize the Quran. And there's always this constant pressure to try and centralize the Quran, when eventually it got to a point that there were too many differences in too wide a space, and it became impossible. And so what ended up happening was a post hoc invention, a romanticization of the idea that there were different recitations that could all go back to the time of Muhammad, when actually that just makes no sense. And that then Muslims themselves were forced by further evidence to extend that idea of 7 to 10 different recitations. So that's my thoughts, guys. The evidence from the hadiths is clear that there isn't a singular Quranic text, and that the evidence shows that there was no perfect preservation of the text. And what I'm going to go into next, I'm going to have a break from this topic. I'm going to come back to it at some point in the future. But what I'll go into next is the kind of stuff that Hatun Tash and J. Smith did years ago, and Hatun Tash is still doing, which is textual variants connected to the readings, the Qiraat, before following behind Dr. Dan Brubaker and again J. Smith, looking at the Rasim. So this is going to be laying out the arguments based upon 3 strands of evidence. But I'm going to take a break from this, and I'm going to go on to other topics because there's lots of other things to talk about. So any questions, please direct them to me. I'm going to do a couple of questions before I go and get some food. Tell me your thoughts, guys. Did you find that useful? Please let us know. Give us some feedback. So a 10 for this is amazing, a 1 for please stop talking about this, and anything in between, so that I got a feel for how useful the content is that I'm putting up for you guys. Okay, I think there might be some internal discussion going on. I know there is a bit of a lag between me stating something and you guys responding to it. Okay. So I just want to show this question. It's not that it's connected to the topic, but for whatever reason, it is not letting me show it. I'll just read it. There we go. From 1 Peter 5:12, the name Silvanus is mentioned as him being the writer or so. So, Bob, can I still, as a Christian, say Peter is the author of 1 Peter? I think, let's just pull that up. It's always worth checking what's going on. So 1 Peter 5:12. I do love it when you do an entire presentation and then someone asks a question that's completely disconnected to what you're talking about. Makes me wonder whether anyone's paid any attention at all. Okay, so my computer's going really slow. So bear with us, please, guys. Flipping heck. All right, let's try this again. 1 Peter 5:12. Therefore, I intend to remind you constantly of these things, even though you know them and are well established in the truth that you have. Oh dear. Sorry, bear with us. My computer's going very slow and it's actually gone to the wrong place. Though Silvanus, there we go, through Silvanus, whom I know to be a faithful brother. Oh, what is going on with my computer? Stop. Through Silvanus, whom I know to be a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly in order to encourage you and testify. So actually, bro, in that text, what is being discussed is that it is by the hand of Silvanus. So Peter is essentially dictating the letter. That's neither problematic nor is it troubling. So I think our concepts of authorship today, I think they would probably even include this, If I was to ask, for example, Gypsy to transcribe everything that I'm saying in the next 30 seconds and they tapped away everything that I was saying and typed it all out, I would be the author of those words, even though Gypsy is the one that would be typing it out. The fact that Gypsy types it out doesn't mean that the words aren't mine. So I actually could say, yes, Peter is clearly the author of 1 Peter in answer to your question. Okay, sorry about the delay it took to answer that, but my computer has just gone super, super slow. Okay, guys, you guys seem to yeah. And you guys seem to be talking amongst yourselves. There's not many questions for me. So I'm going to end it there, guys. I hope you found it useful. Some of you let me know, and some of you haven't. So God bless you all, and good night.